night tweets to drinking bleach to tear-gassing citizens and staging a photo op. We knew Trump was out of control when he was president. Then he lost the 2020 election and snapped, desperately trying to hold on to power. Now he's running again, this time threatening to be a dictator, to terminate the Constitution.
If I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath.
Trump wants revenge, and he'll stop at nothing to get it.
We are a month away from the first presidential debate, and the Biden campaign is ramping up its attacks on Donald Trump. Now, how they plan to do that partly depends on the outcome of Trump's first criminal trial, which could wrap up as early as this week. If Trump is found guilty, NBC News has learned that the Biden campaign is deciding, quote, whether to brand him as a convicted felon. Well, he would be. So joining us now is the co-chair of the Biden-Harris campaign and former senior advisor to the president, Mitch Landrieu. All right, Mr. Mayor. He's also the former mayor of New Orleans, which is why I will always refer to him as Mr. Mayor, because my mama and daddy raised me right. Mr. Mayor, let's start there. Less than a month out from the debate, what is the plan? And if, in fact, Donald Trump is convicted, are you going with the convicted felon Trump label?
Well, Simone and gang, thanks. It's great to see you, and it's great to be back. If I might, with your permission, start off with this. Tomorrow is Memorial Day. It's the day that we as a nation take a moment, step back, and remember all of the men and women that gave their last full measure to preserve our freedom and democracy. I had the honor of standing on the beach at Normandy, where the cemetery is, and of course being in Arlington. It takes me to a place of, number one, being thankful and remembering the sacrifice that people have made to secure our freedom. And then it just makes my blood boil that we have somebody who wants to be president of the United States that called all of those people losers and suckers, because they were fighting to protect our freedom. Freedom, democracy, the fact that we all come to the table of democracy as equals, free and fair elections, the idea that we all abide by the rule of law. And Donald Trump, who is now unhinged and dangerous, and this is what our strategy is going to be, just to tell the people the truth about who he is and remind everybody that when he was in office, as you may recall, during one of the worst pandemics and crises that we've ever had, his solution, his leadership style was to tell everybody to drink bleach. And then when, of course, he didn't win the election, he decided to become delusional and act as though he did. And just to remind everybody, he lost by 8 million votes. And his idea of leadership was, in fact, to incite an insurrection. And when the mob went to the Capitol and for the first time put a Confederate flag in that sacred space and were threatening to kill his vice president, he sat back and literally did nothing. Now, he's also, if you can imagine this, decided to actually be worse and to do more. So when he was given an opportunity by Time Magazine to say, what would you do different? He said, well, I was too nice. I'm going to be meaner. And so our strategy, again, is just to tell the truth about who he was, what he has done, what he is going to do now, which, of course, you all have heard about it because you've talked about it. He's now talking about asking the country to give him immunity to take SEAL Team 6 and assassinate his political opponents. I mean, this is cuckoo land stuff. The President Trump is unhinged. He's dangerous, and we cannot let him get back to the Oval Office.
So, Mr. Mayor, just for the record, he was also the Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana. So from one LG to another, welcome. It's always good to see you, bro.
Thank you.
I want to play up more because I think it's important, and I love the way you started the conversation, noting the importance of this weekend. The Biden campaign has put out the statement referencing the unified right that Donald Trump wants to create, noting this Memorial Day weekend, the American dream so many sacrificed for is under threat from Donald Trump, a man who called those who made the ultimate sacrifice suckers and losers, dreams of himself as a dictator who oversees a unified right. Can I repeat that for those of you who don't understand what this moment is? Donald Trump himself calls those who served and died for this country that we will remember this weekend, suckers and losers. And he sees this as an opportunity to create a unified right. How important, everything else, everyone's talking about the economy and gas prices, all that's important. Let's talk about what people are feeling on that front. But you can't lose sight of this truth as well. And how do you create that lane where both of those things are brought together? You see the unification of the country around this idea that Donald Trump is a threat. You worried about gas prices? Well, guess what it will be for a man who wants to impose tariffs. At the same time, wants to be a dictator.
Well, Governor, you make the case, and the reason why we keep repeating it over and over again is because after COVID, some of us have selective amnesia, and we seem to have forgotten. In the world that you and I lived in, you're a Republican, I'm a Democrat, you and I would argue about the best way, for example, to build a road, or the best way to create a tax structure, or maybe the best way for law enforcement to do their work. All of those arguments take place in a frame where both you and I understand that the Constitution, people's rights and responsibilities are all equal, and that if one of us gets out of the way, the system will pull us back into place. Donald Trump is the first president in the history of the United States that wants to burn that system to the ground. He wants to change the whole system. He wants to uproot the tree and all of its roots. He does not believe in democracy, and that is what President Biden is fighting for. That's why he's given 7 speeches on it. So, of course, the president is concerned about the economy, which is why he passed all of the legislation that he passed that has helped create 15 million jobs. Of course, he's concerned about people's cost of groceries, which is why now we've moved inflation from 9% down to 3%, and we continue to go after big pharma, big oil, all these companies who are taking profits when they should not be, making sure that we reduce people's costs on insulin, trying to keep health care. Donald Trump wants to get rid of people's health care. He wants to take people's rights away from them. Now, this is not an exaggeration. He's the one who put 3 people on the Supreme Court for the intent purpose of eviscerating Roe versus Wade. And if that's the first thing they've come after, and now they're getting in state after state after state, where they now criminalize abortion, and the Supreme Court the other day took away rights, voting rights, by allowing legislatures to gerrymander and to take away the rights of African-American citizens. What do you think they might come for next? Because that is what Donald Trump wants. And, of course, now you've seen he doesn't think the law applies to him. So we are in real threat in this country, and that is essentially what this election is about. It's about all that other stuff. But you can't have the argument about all that other stuff if your democracy does not exist and freedom is not secured.
Mr. Mayor, Lieutenant Governor, I don't have a third title to give you, but I do want to point out that part of this is, of course, about highlighting Donald Trump's record, and then the other job of the campaign is highlighting what President Biden has done. Let's pull up the full screen of some of these accomplishments, what the campaign is calling the Great American Comeback. Gas prices down, food prices falling, incomes rising across every income level. I don't need to tell you, this conversation we come back to all the time. You have all these accomplishments. Now the job becomes selling those to the American people, making sure that the dots are connected. What does it look like to connect those dots?
Well, first of all, again, this campaign really is just getting kicked off. The president is really excited about the debate, so he can ask Donald Trump why in the world he wanted to eviscerate Roe versus Wade and criminalize abortion and start a war on women. He wants to talk to Donald Trump about his need to want to create political violence and to hurt his political enemies. He wants to talk to Donald Trump about his vision for the future of America, where his idea of creating jobs is to give billionaires tax breaks and balloon the deficit. So that's what he's going to talk about. But he's also going to talk about his accomplishments. And that list that you put there, compared to all the other presidents that have served, that is a fantastic list of accomplishments that has created 15 million jobs, lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, protecting health care, reducing the deficit, and on and on and on. But the president, who understands that people are still hurting, are also fighting to reduce the cost. But his clear message is this: if we do not have a democracy, none of those things will happen in the future, which is why he's putting democracy at the top of the list. And let me say this: people should remember that when Joe Biden took over, we now know that we were in an active insurrection. We now know that we had a pandemic that was the worst in the world. And in all of that, he displayed the kind of leadership of running to problems, finding solutions, putting the American people on the right track. What did Donald Trump do? He sat in the White House and watched people go through our Capitol with a Confederate flag, threatening to kill people, and he did nothing. He did zero. And when people were dying from the pandemic, when leadership during a crisis is needed, he asked people to kind of settle down a little bit, take care of yourselves, and drink a little bit of Clorox, and the world's going to get better for you. Now, those two choices are pretty clear. And I think that there's no question about it. And this is why I feel really confident that Joe Biden's going to win, because I believe in the American people. And I believe when all is said and done, and you're facing Joe Biden and Donald Trump, they're going to pick the future, they're going to pick freedom, and they're going to pick Joe Biden.